All right, look at that. The art of fighting without fighting. Usul al-Fiqh edition. Look at that little picture there. Come at me, bro. And that's what some of these, that's the reality of some of these guys on Twitter. That's what they look like.
Oh man, I'll plead the fifth on that one. But
I probably just broke one of the rules that you're going to go over right now.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll have a redemption slide, inshallah.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, let's kick this off. Bismillah.
Bismillah. So I don't see the slides, but I'm going to trust, inshallah.
Okay.
That they're aligned with that segment of the discussion. Okay. How much time do we have, Sheikh Shadee?
If you go onto YouTube on your phone and minimize it or lower the volume, you'll see what slide Omar has on.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let me do that. And our cutoff for time?
No, we have a while. Yeah, and usually cut off. We got 30, 40 minutes, whatever you want, 20, 30, 40 minutes.
Oh, okay, I see the slides now. He threw it on. Very nice. Okay, Bismillah, Rasulullah. So this slide deck is actually, I didn't have time to brand it for NBF for you guys.
No problem.
It's a short presentation I gave recently at Yaqeen Institute internally on how does a layman navigate the spectrum? Because, alhamdulillah, as an organization at Yaqeen, we have over 100 between part and full-time employees, and some of us are specialized in certain domains that are not necessarily research related, whether it be marketing or design or engineering or video or whatnot. So how to just conceptualize all of this. So obviously someone like Dr. Shadee or a student of knowledge knows that we study this, or we should be studying this in the usul al-fiqh, the legal theory discipline. But I remember when I first was taught this, read a few books on this, I remember vividly feeling like I was educationally hijacked.
SubhanAllah.
That's the term I keep saying. Because this is taught in usul al-fiqh, but it actually pertains to everything, like every aspect of Islam. How do I stratify? Is this like a deal breaker or not? Is this something I should feel my faith threatened by a difference in or not? Because sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. But you're never given this epistemological framework, right? This sort of, how can I be consistent if I have the guts, the courage, the taqwa to be consistent, right? To be principled. So these are the principles. It's not actually specific to usul fiqh. Anywhere, any view, whether it's in aqidah, creed, whether it's in fiqh or otherwise. Tazkiyah, right? So next slide. This is how I think we can conceptualize this simply enough, right? So not every difference is a disagreement, right? Some differences are differences of variety. Variety meaning it's all traceable to the Prophet ﷺ. And in that case, we should all agree that it is haram to object, right? Because you'd be objecting to something traced to the Prophet ﷺ. So for instance, Maliki Yawmiddin, Maliki Yawmiddin, right? Anfusikum or Anfasikum, right? The qira'at of the Quran, or the wordings of the adhan and iqama. Whether you do tikrar or not, the repetition or not, between the Hanafi. These are actually variety. These both have a degree of traceability to the Prophet ﷺ. They're not right and wrong, they're right and right. The most we can discuss in this category of variety, ikhtilaf tanawwu', is what's the better thing to do in this context, but we're not allowed to say it's a wrong thing to do, right? And you can even think of like Islamic work, like should we be in the knowledge domain, the education domain, or in the inspiration domain? Should we be doing more activism, or should we be doing sort of more political advocacy, mobilization, printing of masahif, whatever, social work, whatever it's going to be? This is variety. No one can say those are not from Islam.
Yes.
We're just sort of tweaking. We can't undermine any of that because you'd be undermining something that is axiomatically Islamic, categorically Islamic.
Correct.
Then there's disagreements. Disagreements is when there's rights and wrongs, halal and harams, haqq and batil, right? And when these disagreements exist, they can't all be right at the same time. There's times when we're going to excuse them and times when we're not. So when we're not going to excuse them, it doesn't mean we're necessarily need to be hostile with someone that has them, but we're just not willing to entertain the conversation that this could be right. It's categorically wrong. And so think of just easy examples, things that violate ijma', right? Allah is one, the Quran's his book, Muhammad is final prophet, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Dhuhr is 4 rak'ahs, hijab is mandatory. We're not open to sort of like your acrobatics to tell me why the whole ummah was sort of like misfired on that one, right? Not up for discussion. It doesn't mean I have to sort of like be red in the face about it every time I meet someone or hear of, no, that's like a protocol issue for later. But let me get to where the actual issue is, the actual sort of practical benefit for a lot of us listening to this podcast or the likes or in Islamic work or in Muslim spaces deal with, which is excusable differences. How do we know? Because sometimes we have misplaced concreteness. We think it's concretely unexcusable, illegitimate, or the likes, right? How do we know when something is unexcusable? The easiest way for time purposes and is just matters of agreement, when the scholars have unanimously agreed on something or a number of things. Because the Prophet ﷺ, said, and the hadith has some substantiation to its chain, that my ummah will not agree upon falsehood. And he also said, this is a more authentic chain, this is mutawatir, like massly transmitted, like there will always be a group of my ummah visibly on the truth, apparent, al-haqqi zahirin. That means if the ummah was wrong, someone would have stepped up and said, excuse me, guys, right? There will always be dissent, meaning disagreement, to make sure the truth is never absent from the ummah for a moment. And so typically excusable, we're talking about scholarly views. There is scholarly precedent for them. They don't come out of nowhere in an unprecedented way, right? Feel free, Sheikh, if you want to just we can tandem in this. If anything I'm dropping or any blind spots, please.
No problem. No problem.
So next slide. So scholars again disagree now. They have conflicting views. Let's say they have a set number of views, and these scholars don't condemn each other, right? So what does that mean? When they don't condemn each other, they still agree to pray behind each other or whatever. We're saying these views are valid. Before we get to these 3 points right now, the view is valid. I'm not saying I'm saying it is irrational, and this is the view of the majority, al-mukhatti and al-musawwiba, that the mujtahids, the scholars that exert themselves to arrive at a view, those views are valid if certain, boxes are checked. Let's leave that out of the conversation for now. But valid means we don't know until the day of judgment which one was correct. All we know is that we're all exerting our capacity, and if we wind up being correct, we get 2 rewards, and if we're incorrect, we get 1 reward. That's it. That's what the hadith says, right? When a person passes their judgment, of course, you need to be qualified to pass judgments to begin with. You pass your judgment and you turn out to be correct, you get 2 rewards. Your effort, your trophy. But the trophy is Allah. It's not something you flex on people and smash over people's heads, right? It's with Allah. And then if you're wrong, you get 1 reward, meaning for effort.
Yes.
So now as a layman, what do I do with this? I'm going to say, okay, the scholars had a set number of views, and they didn't condemn each other for these views. This means they agree on the validity, not correctness, validity of these views, right? So let's use the hijab example. They said, does she cover the face or not cover the face? There's a whole long discussion, right? They're both valid. To sort of write one off as liberal and one as extreme, and there's always fingers pointing to the other side, is dhulm. It is unjustified. They all actually agree that you're the one out of line in that case. They're disagreeing while agreeing that you're uncalled for, unwarranted. The second thing is, when they don't condemn each other, that means they agree it's speculative. It's ijtihadi, right? Like when someone pulls out something and says zakah cannot be spent on da'wah. For instance, I'm sorry, it's a little bit controversial. I don't mean to be forceful. I'm just rushing. But hold on. If it were crystal clear, would they have disagreed on this? When Abu Hanifa rahimahullah said it could be used on Quranic instruction, that's a form of jihad. Or when Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says it could be spent on Hajj and Umrah, because the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha, yes, women have to perform jihad, but jihad that is void of combat, Hajj and Umrah. So if it were clear, did they get this out of their pocket? No, they didn't. Would they have disrespected the Sharia in that way? That is the implication of saying about something they differed over as crystal clear. That's the problem. The implication is you're saying that they're all ignorant or they're all sellouts. Right? No, they let each other disagree, which meant they understood that there is some interpretive bandwidth there. Right?
And the terminology and the narrations give fuel to different opinions. يحتمل المعاني.
I'll give you a real quick example. I was taught growing up that Imam Ahmad, this is exactly how it was said to me. Imam Ahmad had an illegitimate view, basically, that it is mandatory to fast the day of doubt. You know that is Ramadan yet or not, the day of doubt. Actually, Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, now that I'm Hanbali and I know his proofs, it's a pretty there's so much substantiation there. You're gonna say, but the hadith says If it's cloudy, complete, atimmu. He's going to say, no, that wording is disputed. That wording, atimmu, is disputed. The more authentic wording is uqduru, calculate it.
Subhanallah.
Meaning like account for it. He
Yeah.
doesn't mean astronomical. Account for it. You're going to say, faqduru lahu just means like account for it means assume. Why this or that? Say
Yeah.
no. Faqduru in the Quran, qadara alayhi rizqahu means Allah constricted the rizq. So it means constrict Sha'ban and just start Ramadan. So it's
Subhanallah.
like it has a linguistic basis, it has a hadith sort of like authenticity basis. There's a lot. I'm not saying I do and don't follow it. I'm generally Hanbali, but the point is you need to always know there's more to the story. I remember I went to the Hatim al-Hajj once. We were praying Taraweeh all Ramadan together in a Hanafi masjid. And in the Hanafi masjid, they pray their witr in a particular format. Their witr involves praying, for those that don't know, it looks like Maghrib, right?
Yep.
It pray tashahhud in the middle and then tashahhud in the end, in the second and third rak'ah. So I said, Sheikh, the hadith is clear. That's what I said to him. Sheikh, the hadith is clear that your witr should not resemble your Maghrib. So then he smiled at me. You know that grandpa, you're such a fool. Smile. He smiled at me and says, we don't recite, they're going to tell you we don't recite out loud in the third rak'ah of Maghrib.
Subhanallah.
And so I smiled and said, why do they always have an answer? He said, because that's the nature of these subjects. There's always an answer. Your ignorance of the answer doesn't mean that there's no answer.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the third part is the truth must be among those views, meaning there's no room when they differ on a set number of views for there to be a third one. And we covered that in the previous slide, the issue of unprecedented. No one can come now and say, hijab means modesty. It doesn't actually refer to a garb or boundaries for the garb. No, I'm sorry. Like the ummah was not in the dark between these two views, and they're all wrong until God's gift to the world, you showed up.
Yeah.
This is just like astronomically, like colossal levels of conceit to bring about an unprecedented view.
You know
That
what?
is-
If I want to make 2 points that you mentioned there. You know who the people who have that mentality usually come from the demonstrable fields, sciences, because their heroes made discoveries and inventions that everyone thought was crazy and then turned out to be acceptable. Because in the field of science and demonstration, you always want to push the boundary. Whereas religion is a transmitted field. Transmitted knowledge wants to go, is more accurate the further back you go. Right? That's the difference between the, that's why those types of people, these reformers, tend to be, they idolize those people in the demonstrable fields. They're trying to be like that. That's the first point I want to mention. Second point you brought up, when he's correct, he has 2 rewards. So both of them have the reward with Allah for trying. And I've always thought possibly the second reward, or the sign of it, comes in the acceptance of the other scholars that your view has validity. That's one possibility.
I've never come across that.
Yeah.
Needs a process, but it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Perhaps, mashallah. You know, Sheikh, also like we just want to qualify for people that we don't mean that like Islam is stuck in antiquity. Of course, you're not saying that.
Yeah.
But there are principles in Islam that are made with built-in flexibility to engage the evolving dynamics and push the boundaries, or apply at least to those on the frontiers of invention and progress and the likes. But when it comes to the constants of our deen, like it's almost like our deen is like perfectly designed in a way that like the orbits of the planets, there is an orbit. And that's why the planets don't crash. But at the same time, they're moving within their respected orbit. So respecting the constants of the deen is the only way actually to move forward.
Correct. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair for that, Sheikh.
Right.
So, you know, even I was thinking, I heard a guy, I'm sure you've come across this sort of like this revisionist trope. It's like low-hanging fruit, I guess, for us. You talk about like, we misunderstood what the real problem of Qawm Lut was. These scholars think it was because of like same-sex acts. It was actually because of rape. Because, you know, Surah Al-Ankabut says, إِنَّكُمْ لَتَقْطَعُونَ السَّبِيلَ, you're like road bandits. So they were like, the problem was actually rape. And you have this whole revisionist thing of like, it's because there was no consent, because consent, obviously, the modern paradigm, the reductionist modern paradigm of it being everything. But the problem with that is, if this really was the case, that means not just were 1400 years of scholars monkeys, right? Didn't understand anything. But it also meant that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the Prophet ﷺ failed to raise them, right? He failed as an educator. And that also means that Allah Azza wa Jal, when He told us this is a clear book, that's not true as well, because apparently there's nothing clear about it if everything's discussion.
Yep.
So I just want people to also keep in mind the implications of not recognizing the constants or the off-limit points, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
On both poles, right? Next slide, inshallah. So what do we do? What do we do in light of this? Just remember the 4 rules. The layman is not entitled to a personal opinion. Everyone needs to understand this. You know, Ibn Abd al-Barr, since I'm going to be pandering to the Malikis today. Ibn Abd al-Barr, rahimahullah, the great Maliki scholar, he reports ijma', scholarly agreement, أن المقلد ليس بعالم وأن العلم معرفة الحق بدليله. That the muqallid, the layman, you know, muqallid, layman, it comes from qilada. Qilada means like a chain around your neck. It means a collar. Meaning, you need to understand that you're just being dragged along. And that's why taqleed, and this is not controversial, taqleed is haram except for darura. The only reason you would imitate someone in your deen is because dhuhr time is going to end, and I'm not going to be a scholar or mujtahid by the time asr time comes, so I have no choice. But ideally, we should all sort of own our own deen and religious opinions. So he's saying, but recognize that. Read the room. Where are you? Who am I? You are not a alim. And that ilm is knowing the truth and the evidences for it, right? What does he mean you're not a alim? He's not trying to insult you and say like you're like an ignorant fool. He's trying to tell you that it's haram for you to have a view. You don't have a view. You're following someone else's view. So if you don't have a view, you can't be defending a view or promoting a view. You don't have one. You don't have one. That's number 1. The second bullet, the scholar is not, now the scholar, check this out. The scholar is not entitled to impose their view on others. Think about that. Why did like Abu Yusuf al-Qadi and Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani or Ibn al-Qasim or other, anyone, why did the greatest students of the founders of the 4 schools sometimes disagree with their teacher? Because they were forced to. Why were they forced to? Because they understood that it is haram for me, Allah will hold me accountable to my ijtihad. It's haram for me to follow someone more knowledgeable than me, more pious than me, when on a particular issue, my ijtihad delivered me elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's why they also don't impose it on others. That's why they didn't, their students, or we shouldn't impose it on the peers in scholarship. I'm punishable for departing from my ijtihad. I'm rewarded for my ijtihad. And so how can you bully me into doing something that is contrary to what Allah's rewarding me for, and Allah's punish me if I ignore? That's the idea you want to think about here. As a scholar, you can't even do it, let alone a layman.
Yeah.
The third thing is leadership. Leaders are entitled to compliance within a spectrum of valid views, right? And that's like a rule, like respecting an imam's leadership in the masjid, or a husband's leadership in the home, or the management's leadership in any sort of organization or collective, the state's leadership to pick a moon sighting view, right? Whatever it's going to be. Leaders are entitled to pick a view because you can't get stuck in decision paralysis, right? You don't have to believe in the view. You just have to, they're right to choose one, right? No gaslighting, no pressuring, nothing. The last thing, and this is very important, which is that cooperation. Someone shared with me a clip recently speaking about the importance of cordiality and cooperation, which I really appreciated. Cooperation, which some will call unity, that's why I worded it like that, follows a pros cons calculus. It has nothing to do with everything I just explained.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with valid versus invalid views.
Yeah.
So like cooperating in obedience, ta'awanu al birri wa taqwa. You know, it like if someone believes there's a prophet after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for sure that's an invalid view.
Yeah.
If you believe that God is part of a triune Godhead, right? Trinity, invalid view, fine. Inexcusable, fine. But I can still collaborate with you. So what about people that have so much more in common, right? Even like the scholars agree generally, if you look at how they operate, they agree that shunning a Muslim is only allowed when there is a clear pro there, like a clear benefit, tough love, or sort of like protecting the ummah. And so that's a very dynamic rule that what they agree on.
Yeah.
Like, when is it actually in the best interest of community or ummah to not interact with someone? And we should let those in the kitchen make those decisions, by the way.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, next slide.
I want to just make a quick comment on the compliance.
Please.
When you're sort of managing a institution with hundreds of people in it, you oftentimes need policies. There have to be predictable policies for everyone to know. And whenever people come and say, well, there are other opinions. So I always tell them, yes, there are. But for practicality's sake, we have to choose one, right? So that all of us could live predictably. One of these every masjid does regards the prayer times. Like Salatul Asr, are we going to pray in the earlier time or the latter time? You have to pick one. You can't just do that. You also can't flip-flop. You'll confuse everybody. And you can't allow every group to come in, pray Jama'ah how they want, right? Otherwise, you're going to have chaos. So a lot of times it's policy.
It's perfect example,
Yeah.
Sheikh. You just gave two examples. One example is of like an invalid view that I'm going to cooperate with those who subscribe to it.
Yeah.
I gave that example. You just gave an example of a valid view that I simply just can't house because I'll just drive people crazy. It'll
Correct.
just confuse. So it has nothing to do with valid and invalid. It has to do with sort of maslaha and mafsada.
Exactly.
Right?
That's why when those guys come and argue, happens all the time, I say, Habibi, I'm not going to sit here and discuss haqq and batil. I'm just going to tell you what the policy of the masjid is. That's it.
Got to point to policy. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not discussing haqq and batil. Me and you on our way out of Maghrib or on our way out of Isha at 9:50 p.m., we're not having a discussion on haqq and batil here, right? To decide what is the truth of God's will. That's not going to happen right here. So this is the masjid policy for different reasons, right? And that's it, right? And we have to enforce it. So that's sometimes, a lot of times people conflate policy with capital T truth, right? Exclusively. It's not the case at all.
Nothing but facts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Inshallah.
So now moving on, because I made the mistake that I told
Yeah.
myself don't do if you're going to present, but I made it anyway, which is I spent too much time already on the fiqh of it. And here's why I think it's too much time.
Yeah.
In this ayah in front of you, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah on his book on unity, or his discussions on unity, he says that Allah Azza wa Jal's two descriptions of the human being, ظلوم and jahula, unjust, ignorant, they actually summarize all of the reasons for disunity among Muslims. Dhulm and jahl.
Subhanallah.
Dhulm and jahl. So being unfair, transgressive, and being ignorant, unaware. Of course, ignorance, I just removed it. I removed it in 3 slides. We're done with ignorant. It's over. It's actually the easiest of the two. The easier of it. The dhaloom is the harder part. Because we're by nature, we're selfish creatures, right? So that's going to run us into a whole lot of messes, having double standards, having our group prejudice, our individual preference, our clouded judgment. We're more emotional than we are rational. And so the rational, even scriptural stuff is actually the smaller part of the puzzle. But how do we work past our emotionality and our egotism and the diseases of our hearts that manifest in religious sort of discourse and all of that? And so like if jahl is going to be removed with ilm, education, knowledge, then dhulm is going to be removed with taqwa, with tazkiyah, right? With spiritual labor. Only through tazkiyah can you bring about pious restraint, right?
Yes.
To check, to not bully others, to bow to my views. That's what you're doing. You're asking people to bow down to you, your group, your opinion, my. It's like that caricature sometimes we draw about the idol worshiper who's like, obsessing over make sure he eats, and we have an inner idol sometimes, an invisible idol, and we want others to bow to it, right? And so only through working hard, putting in work, labor to will we be able to humble ourselves, or Allah will humble us through that, to be more accurate, to realize that, I don't have a right to do this. I need my brothers and sisters. I can't uphold this mission alone. It basically prevents us from carrying out the disagreements in the wildest, fullest iterations of them, right? And if we don't spend enough time on morality and spirituality and tazkiyah, we're going to find ourselves in a lot of the places we find ourselves in today, right? Even if we have the ilm. You know, actually, you can jump straight into the next slide. I'll show you that even if we are scholars, we can still fall into this. So this is Ibn Aqil al-Hanbali. He died about 950 years ago. And it's not a streak we should be proud of. But read what he has to say. He says, for those that are just listening in, he says, I have personally witnessed how nothing prevents people from transgressing but their inability, meaning not their taqwa, not their fear of God. I'm not referring to the common folk, but even the scholars. During Ibn Yunus, the political leader, the hands of the Hanbalis were unleashed. They would unfairly abuse the Shafi'is in matters of jurisprudence to the point where they would not allow them to openly recite the Basmala.
Subhanallah.
Or perform qunut, meaning in Fajr, what the Shafi'is do, which are both matters of ijtihad, scholarly interpretation. When the era of Nizam came, or Nizam, and Ibn Yunus passed away, the Hanbalis lost their power, and the Shafi'is then overstepped against them like tyrannical rulers. They prepared for them imprisonment, and they harmed the people with slander, and the scholars with accusations of anthropomorphism, likening God to his creation. I reflected on the situations of both groups and found that neither of them had internalized the ethics of sacred knowledge. What are these actions but those of soldiers who assert themselves during their reign and occupy the mosques in their idleness or with their idleness?
Subhanallah.
And it's tragic.
Ajib.
Right?
Yeah.
This is us. This is our destiny. Ummah. You know, when the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, that famous mosque in Medina, people often visit, Masjid al-Ijaba. It's called the Masjid of Response because it's where the Prophet ﷺ very famously got a response for 3 of his du'as. He entered and prayed 2 rak'ahs, the Hadith of Muawiyah in Sahih Muslim. No, the Hadith of Sa'ad. He entered the Masjid of Banu Muawiyah, and he raised his hands for a long time after 2 rak'ahs. And then he turned to the people and he explained, I asked Allah for 3 things, and he gave me 2 and he withheld 1. I asked him that he not allow an external enemy to ever eradicate my ummah, and he promised me that. He said if the whole planet were to unite against your ummah, it would not be able to remove it or put it into extinction. And I asked him to not allow some plight or epidemic to annihilate my ummah, and he promised me that. وَسَأَلْتُهُ أَلَّا يَجْعَلَ بَأْسَهُم بَيْنَهُم فَمَنَعْنِيهَا. And I asked him to not allow their hostilities to be against each other, their aggressions to be inward facing.
Subhanallah.
He held that one from me.
Subhanallah.
It hurts because first of all, this is this is your Prophet ﷺ. This is what he's worried about. So are we worried about this?
Subhanallah.
The second thing is that Allah said no. This is going to be a recurring, Medusa head of a problem that's going to keep rearing its ugly head on the ummah. And it doesn't mean all times, all places. We need to work to be the exception to that.
Yeah.
Right? And all over. Like, let me, after sort of blasting the Hanbalis at Ibn Aqil Hanbali's hands right now, let me reverse it. It's like all of us. Imam al-Tabari, rahimahullah, did not get a proper burial. Because Imam al-Tabari, Sayyid al-Mufassirin.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, because when he came to Baghdad, he had a book like that documented all of the points of scholarly agreement, ijma', or the scholarly views, and the Imam Ahmad's views weren't in there. So like the toxic mobs beat him up and they stoned him in his house. And how dare you disrespect our Imam? Imam Ahmad was the last of the Imams. So like,
Subhanallah.
He was not yet in the books, if you will.
Yeah.
Right?
Subhanallah.
So they took it as like an affront.
Subhanallah.
And so they say that they buried him almost incognito in the middle of the night because he was stuck in his house for so long. When he eventually died, they couldn't even make public calls for the janazah.
Ajib.
And this is not like an isolated incident. Like Imam al-Bukhari. Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, when he came to Naysapur, when he came to Nishapur, for 12 kilometers, people were lined up throwing gold and like rice and stuff at him. Like, that 6-foot, 10-foot wedding line, the red carpet, 12 kilometers. And then he gets to Nishapur, and then some people sort of like misrepresent him, and the whole Quran being created thing was abound, and someone kept trying to bait him into a question for, a gotcha moment for TikTok. So, and you call the Quran created, And so, what do you say about the Quran? So he used to ignore him. And one time he answered, and he said, Al-Qur'anu kalamullahi ghayru makhluq wa kalamuna makhluq.
Subhanallah.
or nutquna bihi makhluq, right?
No.
The sound we make is created, but the words of Allah. So this guy, of course, took it, didn't know what to do with it, or he knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. And so the greatest Imam of Nishapur, who had those 12 kilometers of people out there to celebrate, said, whomever sits with Muhammad ibn Ismail is just like him.
Subhanallah.
And everywhere he went, no one would attend his classes anymore.
Subhanallah.
And he goes back to Bukhara, and sort of the jealous scholars of Bukhara also sort of like rile up the government against him. And that is why Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, famously, the night before he dies, or a few nights, he grabbed his beard and he said, Allahumma daqat alayya al-ardu bima rahubat, faqbidni ilayk. Oh Allah, there's no room for me left on earth. The earth is suffocating me, so take me back to you.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
And it's not just Imam al-Bukhari, I was reading, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, like for maybe a little bit more uplifting, when he got jumped in Egypt, he got jumped for sort of speaking out against what he believed were very extreme, superstitious, mystic groups, right? Extreme, unsanctioned forms of tasawwuf. And so when his brothers and his students tried to bring it to the guys who jumped it to Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, I don't permit you to. He said, you're either doing it for me or for Allah or for yourselves. If it's for Allah, they may be rewarded for what they did.
Subhanallah.
Because this is their ijtihad. As far as they know, their scholar is trustworthy, and their scholar told them, I'm an enemy of Islam.
Subhanallah.
He said, and if it's for Allah, no. If it's for me, I've forgone my right. And if it's for you, go ahead and do it, but you won't be allowed to sit in my classes anymore.
Subhanallah.
My followers. So we're gonna have to rip past the deadlocks. We're just gonna have to tolerate each other and look inward a little bit. Maybe the problem's a little bit here. Sheikh, I teach classes on tazkiyah, tasawwuf classes at Mishka for years, and it's the importance of biographies. What I'm trying to say, because time is now. But biographies are so important because they are what teach us, as Dr. Hatim even often mentions, how to instinctively respond when things hit the fan.
The application of the theory.
Christians often say, what would Jesus do, right?
Yeah.
But in a sense, you try to internalize the ethos of a certain spirit.
Yeah.
Right? So the Islamic brotherhood spirit, the Islamic spiritual refinement spirit, the Islamic egoless spirit, when you see it through biographies, it helps you apply it in a different scenario, instinctively. That's the idea. That's why Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, of course, as you know, he used to say, تَرَاجِمُ الرِّجَالَ أَحَبُّ إِلَيْنَا مِنْ كَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْفِقْهِ. The biographies of men, meaning the righteous, are dearer to us than all of these technicalities about law. Not to a'udhu billah, disparage, sacred law, but that's what he means. Sometimes it can backfire. Ibn al-Jawzi said this too. It can become ammo, right?
Yeah.
I think even you one time shared a very nice, it's kind of stuck with me, a meme of sorts about Imam al-Haddad, rahimahullah, who said knowledge is like fire. It can enlighten and it can also burn the place down.
Yeah.
Right? Depending on the receptacle.
That's right.
You're getting in there.
Yep.
And so when I was teaching tazkiyah, the Imam al-Harawi, rahimahullah, Imam al-Harawi is a very interesting person. He was larger than life in his life.
Yeah.
But extremely controversial. So for those that don't know, Imam al-Harawi, rahimahullah, was an Athari, scripturalist when it came to Aqidah, Hanbali in fiqh, very much in the Sufi tradition, right? But he was always there was lots of beef. And
so say Abdul Qadir al-Jailani then.
Perhaps, yeah. So al-Harawi, let me share with you a few things. I actually pulled them out. I'm going to pull out my notes for a second. But basically he says, just to give you a high level, I was subjected to the sword, meaning the guillotine execution, 5 times in my life.
Subhanallah.
Not a single time was I ever told, change your madhab, change any position. I was told, be silent about those who disagree with you, and I couldn't keep silent. Right? And so he felt a certain obligation to teach a few things, and so on and so forth. So let me tell you about sort of how shaitan does this even with scholars when there's not enough tazkiyah, right? When Alp Arsalan, the famous commander, Manzikert and Nizamiya Academy and whatnot, right? That produced Al-Khali, rahimahullah. Alp Arsalan, when he came to Herat, Afghanistan, Al-Harawi is from Herat.
Yeah.
So lots of the Hanafi and Shafi'i scholars, they came complaining of Al-Harawi. And like they did to like, you know, debate him and things like this. Then when he came, they refused to debate, they rescinded. But let me share with you the part that when he first came to town, Al-Barsalan, the warrior and commander, the scholars came to Al-Harawi's house. And they enter his house and they tell him the Sultan is here, we need to go pay our respects, but we wanted to come give you salam first on our way there.
Okay.
And they had this sort of like plot in mind. They created a statue, a sanam, made out of brass.
Okay.
And they slipped it in his mihrab under his sijjada, under his prayer carpet.
A'udhu billah.
Now listen. And then they go to the Sultan and they're like, there's this guy, he's a deviant, he's a mujassim, he gives God human attributes, appendages, limbs, right? And he goes, you don't have to believe us. Go to his house. You're going to find that hidden under his sijjada that he prays on is a sanam, and he claims that Allah corresponds to this image.
A'udhu billah.
So he
Wow.
sends the cops.
Devious.
They flip the carpet. I mean, look, shaitan can get you to justify whatever you want if your heart can house shaitan. I don't care how knowledgeable you are, right?
Subhanallah.
So he sends the cops. The cops sort of raid the house. They find this. He drags him, brings him in. He's infuriated, and he asks Al-Harawi, "What is this?" So he says, "Sanamun yu'malu min as-sufra shibh al-lu'ba." It's just like it's an idol made out of brass. Looks like a stupid toy. And he said, "That's not what I'm asking you." He said, "Then what are you asking me, Sultan?" He said, "I'm asking, what is this doing? These guys," he saw them standing, so like he knew.
Yeah.
These guys say you worship this and you claim that Allah corresponds to this image. And so Al-Harawi rahimahullah, he raised his voice very high and he said, "Subhanak hadha buhtanun azim." Glorified you are. So this is the statement that Allah Azza wa Jal spoke, for those that don't know, when Aisha radiallahu anha was framed. She was slandered. And that's all he said. He refused to defend himself. He just said, "Subhanaka hadha buhtanun azim." And so Allah Azza wa Jal caused something to land in the heart of Al-Barsalan, this guy's being honest, and that these guys tricked him.
Subhanallah.
So he sent him home, like honored and like all these apologies and stuff. And then he turns to these guys and he says, "Be honest with me," and he threatened them. You know what they said? They said, "This guy gives us so much trouble. No one listens to us. He has the crowd."
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
Right? And we wanted to, listen, فَأَرَدْنَا أَن نَقْطَعْ شَرَّهُ عَنَّا. We
Subhanallah.
wanted to protect the people from his deviance.
A'udhu billah.
So, you know, what is it? إِنِّي أَخَافُ أَن يُبَدِّلَ دِينَكُمْ أَوْ يُظْهِرَ فِي الْأَرْضِ الْفَسَادِ.
Subhanallah.
That all of us, right? Pharaoh said, trying to protect you from Moses, altering your religion, and
Subhanallah.
in the world. You know
Yeah.
what's crazy? I'll tell you why they hated him. I'll tell you why, and I'm in a safe space. Good thing we're not recording, Sheikh Shadee. I'll tell you why they hated him. Ash'aris hated Al-Harawi because Al-Harawi used to consider Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari to have left Islam.
Ajib.
Yeah,
Subhanallah.
I don't, of course, I don't subscribe to this view.
Yeah.
Rahimahullah. But that's the idea.
Subhanallah.
That's the ijtihad. That's sort of like the way he went about explaining Asma al-Sifat or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So they had this, they held this against him, right? They took this person. However, when Abu al-Waqt al-Sijzi, rahimahullah, he says, I went to Naysabur, I attended the classes of Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwaini, rahimahullah. Great, of course, you know, scholar of the Shafi'i madhab and Ash'ar. I mean, like, big name, right?
Yeah.
Notice that a Sijzi, the student of Al-Harawi, is attending for who? For
Juwaini.
But not all. He says that when I got there, new face, who are you? Man ant? He said, I am the servant of Sheikh Abu Ismail Harawi. So Juwaini said, radiyallahu an.
Subhanallah.
May Allah be pleased with him. He understood, like, you know, a separate issue. Like, this is just deen for us, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we don't go through the biographies, we get caught up in sort of like the intellectual conclusions or sort of, we see the ummah with those things, and I'm not sort of trivializing them, but in the grander scheme of things, those who we got our views from don't necessarily hold those things, right?
Yeah.
Like even I'll be extra. Let me just stay on subject.
Mm.
But As-Sijzi, when he heard Al-Juwayni say that, he reflected on all of the noise regarding his teacher. He said, "Isma' ila aql hadha al-imam, wa da'a al-tugham inhum illa kal-an'am." He said, "Look at this guy. Look at Al-Juwayni, rahimahullah. This is an imam. Look at the intelligence of this man. Stay away from sort of like the loud, wild mobs in the masses, right?" There's also something else. I'll make this the last part about Al-Harawi rahimahullah. Al-Harawi rahimahullah was like, tier 1 scholar in like Nahu and Sarf and Tarikh and Tafsir and all of this stuff. But also, he had this approach in da'wah where he would dress very, very nice and expensive. And of course, as a Maliki, you can appreciate that. Because Imam Malik rahimahullah had that view about shukr.
Correct. Yep.
That you might have to distinguish yourself sometimes, even if it's ordinarily not correct to do that.
Correct.
Really speaking, right? Because knowledge will be lost if the scholar is not distinguished. So he kind of had that view. He used to wear very expensive clothes, never come to the Sultan. I don't want your money. You can't impress me. But he used to also say, I dress this way so people can look at me and say, wow, I wish I was Muslim.
Subhanallah.
فَيَرْغَبُ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ. And when he would go home, this is what the biography says. I'm reading to the biography. ثُمَّ إِذَا انصَرَفَ إِلَى بَيْتِهِ. And then when he goes home, عَادَ إِلَى الْمُرَقَّعِ. He goes to his sort of clothing. وَالْقُعُودُ مَعَ الصُّوفِيَّةِ. And sitting with sort of like the Sufi practitioners, the people of Zuhd, people of asceticism and minimalism and the likes. في الخانقاه يأكل معهم. He eats with them. ولا يتميز بحال. And you can't tell him apart from anybody else. Then he says, look at this. He says, and through him, he basically was revolutionary. People started showing up early to Fajr, and and the whole town started naming their children Abd, like Abdullah, Abdul Rahman, right?
Subhanallah.
And he would defend the Sunnah, and he would not speak in language that the Sunnah or Quran didn't use, meaning he was athari, right? And so he understood that he was confusing to people.
Subhanallah.
And that's why he said, a final quote, "Man lam yara majlisi wa tadhkiri wa ta'ana fiyya fa huwa minni fi hil." Doesn't understand my project and what I'm sort of entrenched in, and what I believe and what I don't believe, and where I get my stuff from, and whoever doesn't know my biography and accuses me, I forgive them.
Subhanallah.
So anyway, so this is a little bit of everything, right? There's like 3-4 more slides I'll just walk through if you don't mind, and I'll be done.
Yeah, sure. But something reminded me when you said about his books and the interaction with him is that. Can you imagine if someone did a history of dawah in America? Let's say someone did a little MA thesis. 2 people. One guy, his primary source was the masajid. So his primary source about you, about myself, about whoever, is to go to that mosque and talk to the people in that community. Then write your thesis on the history of that person. The other person's sole primary source was to go to Twitter, look at the responses and the tweets and the comment sections, and write your history of this person. You would have 2 different books. Like, you wouldn't even know who the people were, because the written word and the exchanges of the written word are so different. There's no body language in the written word. There's no tone. There's no chit-chat in the written word, which all soften hearts, which all changes everything. And I would say that in the past, their tomes were their books that they wrote, the fatwa they wrote, and the interactions they have also were completely different, which points to your whole point of the importance of the biography of the person. Is more, sometimes it tells you a lot more, or something that would never have been in their book.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So the next slide, وَمَا تَفَرَّقُوا, this is, recurrent, actually. This is not one ayah, right? They only became divided after the knowledge came to them. So it wasn't the knowledge, it was the transgression. Right? Not enough taqwa to curb the transgression. Like, the transgression of the tongue, guys. Like, to know that everything you ever said, you're not just going to be asked, was it right? Was it right? Did you have enough reason to believe it was right? And did you say what's right with justification for the right reason? And there's the intention component. If any of those fail, like you're gonna self-destruct. You're destructing. You're destroying yourself by yourself. That's it. You know, Sheikh, like once said to us something. I was sitting on the couch with him, and he was like saying, do you have any idea how arrogant we were as youngsters? And that's the idea. We hope that as we age, the very least is we can help others get past this stuff faster, and we don't stay. Some of us will stay in it. May Allah protect us all. But he's saying we used to sit there and talk about the rajih this, rajih that, the stronger view this, the stronger view. He said we used to sit there refereeing between scholarly views, and we didn't even know, this is how he put it, some of the disciplines, we didn't even know the name of the discipline, let alone mastering it. Some of the disciplines they used to arrive at those conclusions. Whatever it may have been, right?
Yeah.
You don't even know the name of the science that they use to arrive at that output. So how can you be qualified to sort of assess the output?
SubhanAllah.
So the tongue is the downfall. Hold your tongue, find some taqwa to tie your tongue up with. This is the problem. You know, the poet, when he says, "Ihdhar lisanaka ayyuha al-insanu," hold that tongue of yours, O human being. La yaldaghannaka innahu thu'banu. Do not be stung by a snake. You have a snake in your mouth, right?
Yeah.
Wrap it. You know, لا يلدغنك إنه ثعبان كم في المقابر من قتيل لسانه كانت تهاب لقاءه الشجعان. How many victims of their own tongues exist right now in the graveyards that the bravest of men were afraid to stand in front of in this world? Everybody was afraid to step to him, but he was his own demise. The tongue did.
SubhanAllah.
May Allah Azza wa Jal purify our hearts and not make this share of it just speaking and listening, and may Allah forgive me for the hypocrisy of my words. But there's an ayah here, last ayah, I think. Last slide, last ayah. Once again, this is a recurrent theme in the Quran. I'm not really pointing to an ayah. When Allah Azza wa Jal always says, except for the time Ibrahim alayhi salam is asking, but every time it's Allah saying it, it's always that I sent you a prophet, yatlu alaykum ayatihi, to bring you, to recite to you the book, and thereby I stuck that in the translation. I believe that's the correct way to translate it. But thereby, doing what? Yuzakkihim wa yu'allimuhum. It's always tazkiyah ta'lim. Because when you flip these, the ta'lim just becomes religious tribalism, and nice for religious tribalism. It's the same. He sent you a prophet to pull you out of your mess. The mess was tribalism in many respects. Even the idolatry was a product of, like, my grandparents weren't wrong. You know, when you don't follow the process, we don't use the book right, it becomes what? Religious tribalism. No difference.
If you go back to the previous slide, Omar, I'd like to make a comment about that. It says, and of course the concept or the ayahs was referring to the people of the book when the new revelation came. But there is something for us to learn too. When it says وَمَا تَفَرَّقُوا إِلَّا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُمْ, people who have tribal hostilities or class hostilities possibly, or different families that are feuding with each other, and they're just average Muslims. When knowledge comes, they're so far apart, they will choose different paths. And they'll resume their hostilities on the side of madhabs or manahij or what have you. Can I see both pictures for Omar? Yeah. Let's get both myself and the Sheikh so I can see him. Yeah. Right. So that happens all the time. The two tabaqats that are at each other, the rich and the poor, or east side, west side, whatever tribalisms that feuds that people have, when they both get religious, if they get religious with knowledge first and tazkiyah second, then you'll find that very quickly they're just going to resume their feud on different manhaj of knowledge. That's it.
This is called sort of God-centric religiosity versus identity-centric religiosity. Is Islam sort of a token with which you sort of manifest or like materialize your identity? It's all about me and my group and my preference, or is it really about God?
Yeah.
What's religion for? Many of us tokenized religion. For sort of self-serving purposes.
And when it's truly for the sake of Allah, sometimes the best thing is to leave it because Allah's watching. Why would you play around with it Meddle. Why would you meddle when Allah is watching and He's going to take care of it? And that must be the logic of everyone who lets go of a feud. That there's the only logic to have is that Allah's watching. That's what I need to worry about. And if Allah's pleased with me and I'm being pummeled and people think I'm bad, but Allah's watching, that's all that matters. I could live with that. If you forget about Allah Ta'ala at that moment, that's when you have to fight back. And you have to say, no, everyone's watching. Everyone else is watching. And they got to know that I'm right. Right?
Exactly. No, absolutely. No, I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Put your thoughts.
Yeah, that was it. When it's who are you trying to impress? Who's watching you? That's what's really gonna be the motivator for going and stopping, talking and staying silent. And that must be the main motivator of all the greats in our history who were able to handle so much hatred from others or condemnation from others. And I'll tell you the hardest to handle is the condemnation of the righteous person who for some reason either misunderstands you or has a different view. That's the hardest part to handle, right?
You know, and biographies, yeah.
What's that?
Speaking of biographies, there's one of the senior mashayikh. I wish I could mention his name to give him credit, but I'm just gonna have to share this, fudging the details.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget being in a living room with him, and there was like a whole bunch of scholars, that are differing on some issue. It was a hot topic, but in the Arab-speaking world, and like there was one particular person doing takedowns left and right with viral videos against this sheikh that I'm in the living room with. And the brothers are bringing it up to the sheikh, and the sheikh's like, it's no big deal, adi, things like this, no worries. And then they're like, sheikh, no, but he's framing you as like a crazy conspirator and like an agent for this and that. And he's like, guys, what do you want? You want me to speak about someone who spends hours at night praying? I don't have the luxury to do that. And then he said what? He said, huwa mubtala bi wa ana mubtala bihi. Like he's my test and I'm his test. He may believe that the people feeding him this information are reliable, and maybe there's no negligence there. Maybe Allah will forgive him for it because he thought it was like a reliable path of transmission. He's saying, and it's my test too. And Allah said, وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضَكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ فِتْنَةً أَتَصْبِرُونَ وَكَانَ رَبُّكَ بَصِيرًا. We made you test. We made you all. There's no exception to this rule. Even the guy at the red light, your parent, your spouse. We made you all tests for each other. We made you. So like if you realize it's from Allah, you start reacting, as you said, Sheikh, to Allah, not to the person, right? Oh, atasbirun, will you put up with being principled, right? Atasbirun, wa kana rabbuka basira, and your Lord is watching. And then he said, what did he say? He said, yeah, he's my test and I'm his test and things like. He said, I know why he thinks that I'm sort of like a double agent. It's because I got my U.S. citizenship. There was like a different spelling on the passport. And so someone handed him one of my old boarding passes. And so he saw like a discrepancy in names. And so the poor guy thinks I actually am, working for this or that. And he's even like giving him excuse. I was like, this is like a master class. I need more of this in my life,
SubhanAllah.
This is in private. This is not me posturing, a podcast right now.
Yeah.
This is refusing to do it behind closed doors.
SubhanAllah. That's the hardest part. When it's people who are clearly wrong that are against you, that's far better for you, right? It's far better for everyone, and that's why it's important to. There's a book, I think I never read it, but I like the title. Choose your enemies wisely, right? And your enemies, you don't want your enemies to be people of taqwa. It just doesn't sit right. It is not pleasing to the Prophet. It's not pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal. So I say Sayyidina Ali had so much sabr with those people. Even he had to wage war against some of these people. But he has so much sabr with them. And
because he's a Muslim. Like if you're not gonna have somebody with a Muslim person of taqwa, like like need to be more strategic and sort of like principled allyship outside of our community. What about the community?
Yeah.
Like, we can all agree that the Khawarij, even though the Khawarij today are not the Khawarij of old, but in general, usually you think of certain parts of the world, but the Khawarij called Uthman kafir. The most righteous human being on the earth called him kafir, radiyallahu an. And when Adi ibn Khayar, this is in Sahih al-Bukhari actually, and what's cool is in Sahih al-Bukhari, this is the chapter on Babu Imamatul al-Maftuni wal-Mubtadi', the chapter praying behind someone who's deviant or an innovator. And it says that Adi ibn Khiyar comes to Uthman and says, like, وهو محصور. He was under siege, so they're not even calling him kafir. They've already laid siege to his house. They're about to pince, go in for the kill. Rahimahullah ta'ala, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, wa rahimah. And he goes, I go inside, and Adi ibn Khiyar says, I tell him, listen, anta imamu amma, you're the big imam. I'm on your side, and you're the like superior, you're the khalifa. And we pray behind an imam of fitna. So like the imam of my local masjid is among those who excommunicated you, called you an apostate. وَنَحْنُ نَتَحَرَّجْ. And we don't know what to do. Like, it's just, he said to him, Uthman said to him, radiallahu an, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ أَحْسَنُ مَا يَفْعَلُهُ النَّاسِ. Salat, the best thing people do. فَإِنْ أَحْسَنَ النَّاسَ فَأَحْسِنْ مَعَهُمْ. When people do good things, collaborate in good things. وَإِنْ أَسَاءُوا فَلَا تَظْلِمُوا. And if they do wrong, just don't do wrong with them. And then you just said, like Ali radiallahu anh had to live through not just the siege, but watching the massacre of Uthman. And he comes to Khalid and says to them, listen, you got 3 promises. I will not prevent you from the masjid. I will not prevent you from coming to jihad and the spoils of war. I will not initiate fighting with you. But if you take up arms, I have no choice. Quranic dictate is clear, right? There's baghi here. Like, and they called him kafir too, for people that don't know. Like, this is, but still, it's our brothers. You know, Al-Harawi, I promise is the last thing I'll say. I don't need to sign out. I'm really taking advantage of the platform.
Not at all, not at all.
Subject is very near and dear to my heart, to be honest. A lot of things on this one. But Al-Harawi himself, in his book, Manazil al-Sa'ireen on Tazkiyah, I think it's under the bab of khuluq, says, maybe it's futuwa, he says, along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, كيف لا ترضى لك أخا من رضيه الله لنفسه عبدا.
Subhanallah.
How do you not accept as your brother? Yeah, we can also say brother and say mashallah and jazakallah and all the performatory stuff. But how can you not truly accept as your brother? Someone that Allah has accepted as his servant. Allah deemed him worthy to be a Muslim, to be your servant, his servant. How can you not? And your problem is not with him, it's with Allah.
Subhanallah.
Like you're sort of, are you one-upping the assessment? That's the mentality we want to cultivate, and more of that.
That's the logic. Like, how could you pick an enemy who is someone who is devoting themselves, is okay, maybe has some things which either are mistakes or perceived mistakes. At the end of the day, this person may have a position with Allah Ta'ala. لا تحقر عبدا عسى أن يكون لله وليا. And the implementation is so different from the idea. So there may be ideas in books, but the implementation may be something different. Sayyidina Ali and the Khawarij is the best example, because Sayyidina Ali did this with the Khawarij. He said, you have your mosques, you can join us in jihad and you get your spoils of war, and you're safe as long as until you pick up arms. And he let them live in their village and their town. He is the narrator of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the Khawarij, and if I was amongst you, I would kill them all. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself said this, and Sayyidina Ali is the narrator of the hadith pertaining to executing Kharijites. So if Sayyidina Ali knows the theory, but he also knows the right application, and this time was not the right, that was not the situation. What is the right application? When they pick up swords, right? When they pick up the sword. So there you have the theory and the application. Like you said, what's in the books is one thing. How they actually interacted in real life is a whole different thing.
SubhanAllah, Shaykh, you know, maybe it may even be useful since you've indulged me. You know, we gave examples also on the sort of the extreme, more hardcore than us, whatever way we're going to put it, right? Front, like the Khawarij. But even on the other side, right? There are many Muslims who subscribe to a version of Islam that we may, consider just unexcusable views, sort of like the modernist, progressive, even they're still our brothers and sisters until they truly and knowingly, right, violate some of these axiomatic matters, some of these red lines. And in that hadith of Uthman radiallahu anh, when people are doing good, do good with them, and when they do bad, don't do bad with them. In Bukhari itself, I'm not going elsewhere, right after the hadith, there is a statement from a Zuhri that it could actually be like pulled in here, invoked here, regarding our brothers and sisters who may have a more liberal understanding of the do's and don'ts in Islam. Az-Zuhri rahimahullah, he said right after the hadith, he says, وَلَا نَرَى, in our opinion, even the way he worded it, he qualified, وَلَا نَرَى أَن يُصَلَّى خَلْفَ الْمُخَنَّث. We don't think that the imam should be someone that is mukhannath, meaning effeminate, right? إِلَّا مِن ضَرُورَةٍ لَا بُدَّ مِنْهَا. Except if there is a darura, like some pressing necessity, and the shortage of imams, the next masjid is too far. And so sometimes even within our masajid, we say, no, I don't go to this masjid, it's the conservative masjid. I don't go to that masjid, it's the liberal masjid.
Yeah.
Might be wrong. These actually might be mainstream views. But even if you're right, are we not going to attend the masajid? Are we not going to come together as a community? Are we going to just sit here and sort of just like take these pre-packaged labels and say, you know, canceled and sort of approved of?
And we also have to look at, and then we can close with this because we kept you a long time. But there was one time a child who came, it was a girl, I believe, who came to take food from the plate. And the Prophet ﷺ pushed her back, which was not the norm of the Prophet. Prophet would feed everybody. So when they clearly were wondering, what is this? He said, إِنَّهَا مَدْفُوعَةٌ. Shaitan is the one who pushed her. In other words, Shaitan, even though it looks normal, this request looks normal, seeking food. But the Shaitan is behind this because this is part of some plot that he's plotting, right? To cause fitna of some way, shape, and form. And somebody recently said, subhanAllah, so many things are actually innocent, you know, comments or innocent questions, but they possibly could be egged on by Iblis to stir the pot, right? To get someone to say something that Iblis has calculated in advance, that's going to bother that person. And that person is going to go nuts, right? They communicate amongst themselves in ways that we don't know. Right? Shayateen, we know that. They communicate amongst themselves. And then they whisper into people's ears without that person having any clue that he actually just lit a fire. Right? So it's important this day and age to realize that not everything has to be talked about all the time. And sometimes Iblis is what's behind it. So it's a thing where we always have to be, I would say, considerate of how much things could be misunderstood on the other side in order to avoid that. All right, Sheikh, closing comments from yourself.
No, Jazakallah khairan. There's so much to be said, and don't want to like crowd what I've said. Just this genre of, you know, how do we get the ummah on the same page and the necessity to do, you know, loving. You know, one brother, maybe I'll end with this, that one brother, after having been in that sort of embattled world for a very, very long time, he finally, you know, went to a university and didn't see him for years, and visited him in Umrah, and he told me, you know what, when I finally snapped out of it, I realized that this group makes it hard for me to love my fellow Muslim.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
The irony for me is that you don't need to be in an Islamic university to see that, right? No one believes until they love for their until they love for themselves. You don't enter Jannah until you believe. You don't believe until you love each other. You know, like, shall I tell you of something? If you do it, you love each other. Spread salam. That idea of not giving salam to each other, looking as a default with an eye of suspicion at each other, you know, sort of hearing, you know, the ayat and hadith they mention as sort of like deliberately deviant ways to hijack Islamic understanding. This is a problem. You know, it's a real problem. Even the Prophet ﷺ said, "Halaku ummati fil fasadi wal laban." It's a very interesting hadith narrated by Ahmad, that the destruction of my ummah, meaning phases of it, will happen at the hands of al-kitab wal laban, the scripture and the milk.
Ajib.
And so they said, how would that be possible, Ya Rasulullah? So he said, يَقْرَؤُونَ الْكِتَابَ يُنزِلُونَهُ عَلَى غَيْرِ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ, that they recite the book and they interpret it in, you know, unqualified ways. And limiting the interpretation is one of the unqualified ways, by the way. He said, وَاللَّبَنْ, he said, يَبْدُونَ, that they go out into the desert, وَيَتْرُكُونَ الْجُمْعَ وَالْجَمَاعَاتِ. Basically, they leave the big city to make a nice big dairy farm. And it's crazy because the kitab is the source of guidance. And the laban also represents the fitrah and the other hadith, purity. But even the purest things can become poisonous, can become toxic in the way they're used, not in what they are, right? If they're passing through the wrong uh, receptacle.
So it's cloaked in that they want to be Puritans away from all the rabble of the Muslims and the misguided city folk and sinful city folk. Is that what it is?
No, this was more about like I need more space for more
Ah, I
camels,
see. I
more
see.
money.
Okay.
So basically, it's shubuhat and shahawat. So
Yeah.
shubuhat with the kitab and shahawat with the materialism and the bit.
I see.
So it's not just getting stuck in dunya and the glitter of dunya that'll destroy the ummah. It's also an unqualified, unpure approach to the book as well.
Subhanallah.
Religious and the non-religious, shaitan's not sparing anybody.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah. Jazakallah khair. This is very beautiful, and hopefully we do it again. Bidnillah. Make it a regular visitation to us on the live stream. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate the opportunity, Sheikh.
Jazakallah. My pleasure. Barakallah feek. Shukran. Salam.